The golden approach to ethics I decided to explain is the golden mean. I chose this one because I love the complexity and how we can use this approach in our everyday lives. The text explains the golden mean approach as two opposing vices. The example used in the text was justice. The author explained justice may be found between extreme harshness and complete lack of accountability on page 388. Immediately my mind went to politics and how each side pushes the extreme opposite of their own political party's beliefs rather than meeting somewhere on the spectrum. I never realized exactly why they do that, but the golden mean approach was able to help me solidify a more solid idea. On page 389, the author explains how this approach is designed to avoid extremes. I believe when extremes are applied to people, they aren't rational and we tend to stray away from those extremes. I see this work in other circumstances regarding justice because in other cultures, the consequences for bad behavior vary. Maybe if you steal in one culture, your hand gets cut off, but in America, sometimes nothing happens. That is a prime example of extremes. All these extremes share one thing in common regarding communication, and it's the idea that the spectrum exists. When communicating with someone that may fall differently on the spectrum of extremes than you are both aware you don't want to stand too close to one extreme, or you could potentially turn the conversation south. The spectrum is there for meeting in the middle and understanding for the communication process. The two approaches of ethic and culture are universalism and relativism. Universalism is explained in the text on page 397 as what maintains that ethics is something that goes beyond the cultural limitations of any one cultural system and therefore does not necessarily imply culture. It is the strongest form of universalist position maintains that there is a single set of values and standards of actions that is applicable to all cultures and that there are correct and incorrect ways for these values to be enacted. This approach is meant to show how conversations that take place are often affected. People involved negatively can be seen in both a good and bad light depending on how it is looked at. Relativism is explained as the exact opposite of universalism and places emphasis on cultural relativism. Page 398 explains a strong culturally based position then is simply that each cultural group has its own universalism perspective because I have encountered many different types of people in my life, and it can be judged and evaluated from an insider position. I believe I fit in with the universalism perspective because the people that come into my life and I have interacted with, I've had conversations where either I have accidentally offended someone or someone has offended me, or even been placed in situations where I believe I was treated unfairly and the other person involved didn't. On page 397, the author says those favoring a universalist position use these situations shown how to mistake it to assume that there is somehow one right way for all people to do things. I will say, in the past, I have not fallen into the universal perspective, but after taking this course, I have a different perspective on life in general. I realize that a lot of times people aren't trying to be mean, they just have different life experiences and perspectives on how they make sense of the world. The two ethical principles that I found most important are teachable attitude and peaceful disagreement. Teachable attitude is explained on page 401 as an effort to understand implies a teachable attitude, one that allows a person to learn and eventually helps others to open up to learning about you and your community. Without the willingness to learn from others, our efforts to build positive relationships and serve others may fail. I believe this is important because, as the text says, this principle is essential for helping build positive relationships within a community. This can be very important when communicating with diverse cultures and having different worldviews, values, and beliefs. Peaceful disagreement is the other idea we can I find important because you can agree to disagree and still live peacefully in our own lives. I believe this is important for multicultures and everyone, but a lot of time diverse cultures don't agree, and as the text says, from past experiences forms basic idea in all that these teachings is that violence only results in more violence and problems regardless of the intent or goal. A close look at The lives of those who have followed these nonviolent ideas shows a firmness and strength of mind. I believe if everyone chose nonviolence, we could live happier and have healthier communities. I think the author could have oversimplified the golden public approach because it is something that takes place in our lives daily, regardless of cultural relevance. I would have liked to hear more about the intercultural effect on this approach and the variation brought to our attention on page 390 when the author mentioned a variation of this ethic is something referred to as professional ethic because it resets the idea that we should only act in a way that we would feel comfortable explaining before our own peers.